We're going to tell a little story tonight, the lost sea otters of Oregon, and hopefully will be the found sea otters of Oregon. So welcome everybody near and far. This is a really fascinating story, and there's a lot of chapters to it. The deeper we dive, the more there is to know and learn. So we're going to scoot right through a lot of these chapters tonight. Sit tight. If you need to get up and walk around, please do, but we'll be here for a while. So we're going to take you through the animal, the history, some ecology, and then we're going to talk about our efforts to restore them and bring them back to Oregon. So let's start with Alaka. Now, Alaka is the word for sea otter in the Chinook trade jargon. And this is one of the words that the traders used during the fur era, and we have adopted it. It was adopted as part of our name 20 plus years ago. So Elakha is one of those key words that means sea otter. Thinking about sea otters, the animal, think about a German Shepherd dog. These things are not large animals. They're not nearly as big even as a harbor seal, but they are about 3 times bigger than a river otter. They're anywhere from 80 to 90 pounds, maybe 100 pounds if you get a really large male. So I like to think of them as German Shepherds in the water. They're very social. They float together in rafts, usually segregated by sex. The older males on the outside, the younger males, then the females and pups in their own rafts. So they are very social. They hang out with the same peers, the same cohort for their entire lives. Unlike other marine mammals, these things have no fat and no blubber to keep warm. So how do they stay warm? They have extremely dense fur, up to 1 million hairs per square inch. So it keeps that 35 to 50 degree water on the outside away from their skin, and their internal thermal temperature of about 100 degrees on the inside. So the fur is both their saving grace and, as it turns out, nearly their doom. The other way they keep warm is that they're eating machines. They have a very high metabolism to keep that 100 degree temperature going. So they must eat up to 25 or 30% of their body weight a day in food. They eat primarily shellfish. Shellfish are easy to catch. They don't move around. They're stationary. So they can dive quite deep, but they prefer to dive in shallower waters to pick up sea urchins, crab, abalone, snails, mussels, and other kinds of shellfish, and the occasional slow fish, a little sole or something, or an octopus. The sea otter moms raise their pups one at a time, and this is one of the characteristics of this animal that we have to consider in thinking about restoration on the Oregon coast, is that they have one pup at a time. It takes about 18 months for these things to rear and to wean and to leave on their own. But they are naive when they're born, and the mother has to teach them every single thing: how to dive, how to groom, how to catch food, how to open the food, everything. So the mother is very bonded to that pup for a good year and closer to 2 years. And because they're so bonded, and for the first part of that, she is lactating, that really requires that she's eating for 2. So the caloric requirements of a sea otter is pretty high to begin with, and when she's eating for 2, that really puts a lot of stress on her metabolism, and she must dive and work constantly to get food for her and her pup. So to conserve energy, and this is one of the other characteristics that we're considering, to conserve energy, the moms stay in one area. As long as there's food there, they'll stay put, and they roam only if food is limited. So they don't migrate. They're not seasonal from one area to another. They're staying put to feed their pup and to raise that pup. So this is one of the chief reasons why sea otters may not return to Oregon on their own. We often get asked, is that a sea otter or a river otter? Because people do see these animals down along the beach. River otters do go into the intertidal area to forage sometimes, or maybe even into the waves just beyond. But you can tell the difference because sea otters are much larger, 50 to 100 pounds versus up to 30 pounds for a river otter. Sea otters are very buoyant and characteristically swim only on their backs, whereas river otters are not as buoyant. They ride low in the water. They're a belly swimmer, as seen there on the right. And there's a bunch of other differences that you can see. Crushing teeth from sea otters and tearing teeth from river otters. One pup for sea otters, multiple pups for river otters. So once they were here on the Oregon coast, and they were part of a contiguous population that stretched from northern Japan down to Baja California across the entire North Pacific Rim. The estimate, there's no good count, but the estimate is that there were perhaps 300,000 animals across this entire range. We do not know what the population size in Oregon was, but it was likely not large, certainly not when compared with Alaska or some of the Aleutian Islands or San Francisco Bay. So how do we know they were here? There's a number of lines of evidence that show that. One is that all coastal Indian languages had a word for sea otter, and they were different. These were not borrowed from one another, but each language group had their own word for sea otter, which shows that they were important enough to have a word in that language. We also know from the stories that the elders tell us, the accounts, the ethnographers, the oral histories that refer to the sea otter and human relationships, and the importance of sea otters for regalia, wealth, and stewardship that are still referred to today. We also know from written reports in trade and news contexts, as the Boston men began to come to the Pacific Northwest and as white settlers moved in and started reporting, we find these written reports and references to sea otters both in the trade and as news items. We also know from the geographic place names of today, such as Otter Rock in Lincoln County and Otter Point in Curry County, where in both instances, the local Indian word, the Tillamook people had a word which translates literally to Sea Otter Rock. Similarly, on the South Coast, the Dini language translates for this feature as Sea Otter Rock. And lastly, we know from the excavations and studies of ancient middens and village sites that the bones and teeth from sea otters are present. They are the second most of the numerous of the marine mammal bones. This is a site being excavated in Bandon about 30 years ago, literally in downtown Bandon. And this is the black and white photo is of a nearly intact sea otter skeleton taken from one of these pits. So DNA studies of the these bones show that Oregon was likely a transition zone between the southern sea otter and the northern sea otter. But after 15,000 years of the relationship between Indian people and sea otters, in a historical blink of the eye, they were gone. Beginning in 1741 through about the mid-1800s, first the Russian fur companies, followed by the British and compounded by the Spanish, really hunted all across that Pacific Rim to go after the valuable fur from these sea otters. They were really worth a fortune in trade in China. By contrast, the American fur companies of John Jacob Astor and others were latecomers and really missed out on the sea otter boom, because by the 1870s in Oregon, they were functionally extinct. There were a few animals that survived after that, and by 1911, the remnant population in Oregon was officially extinct. So since the mid-1870s, there really has been no functional population of sea otter in Oregon. However, there were remnant populations, these little island populations, at Big Sur, Prince William Sound, and in secluded spots across the Aleutian chain and down the Kamchatka Peninsula, where sea otters did survive, and these animals and these little populations provided the basis for today's recovered populations. You can see in yellow there where sea otters are now present, and the red areas where sea otters are still absent. And that includes this 800-mile gap between the population in Washington on the Olympic coast and the population that from south of about Santa Cruz on down. So let's take a look at those. So yes, there are sea otters on the south coast of California. Many of you have been to Monterey Bay. Maybe you're actually even living in that area right now and watching this. But on the central coast of California are descendants of the Big Sur survivors that survived the Holocaust at Bixby Creek in the Big Sur area. Today, that population is up around 3,000. It's been stuck at that level for the last number of years. And likewise, the population has been constrained to about Año Nuevo, just north of Monterey Bay, to just down around the point at Point Conception. They're unable to expand out of that range for a variety of reasons, including great white sharks that seem to be prevalent at the northern end that pick off the animals that try to move north. The Washington coast is today up to around 3,000 animals on the Olympic Peninsula. These are descendants from 59 animals that were translocated to this area from Manchitka Island in the Aleutians in 1969 and 70. And that population today, as I say, is about 3,000 animals. Likewise, in British Columbia, the animals were translocated from Manchitka Island in the Aleutians in 1969 through 1972. And today that population is up around 5,000 to 6,000 animals, principally along Vancouver Island, but north along the mainland, and animals are now starting to show up, at least males are starting to show up on Haida Gwaii, which is the large island off to the northwest of the mainland coast. In Alaska, it's a very complicated story. The remnant population of Prince William Sound, which is in the blue area, kind of in the middle of the coast of Alaska there, that population helped to provide animals down the coast into Southeast Alaska where the green area is, but some 400 plus animals were translocated from the Aleutian Islands into the Southeast Alaska area in the late 1960s. Unfortunately, the population out in the Aleutians, the red area stretching across the Pacific, is now in decline, principally through orca predation on sea otters. But the most of the sea otters that are around today are in Southeast Alaska. This is really sea otter heaven. You can see how utterly different the coastline is there from the coast of Washington, Oregon, and California, which are essentially straight lines. Here in Southeast Alaska, there's sea otter habitat almost anywhere a sea otter can swim. And so that 450 animals that was translocated in the late 60s is now up to 25,000 plus animals throughout this area. And in some areas, there are significant human use conflicts between sea otters and shellfishers in some of these communities. There was a brief return to Oregon in 1970 and 71, which lasted until about 1981. Again, Amchitka Island sea otters were moved to a variety of locations, Washington, British Columbia, Southeast Alaska, and Oregon, to escape nuclear testing. Oregon received 93 animals, 29 in the Redfish Rocks near Port Orford in 1970, and another 64 animals to Nellie's Cove at Port Orford and 40 to Cape Arago. But by 1981, they basically had disappeared. And you can see the chart there across the middle that shows that there was no surveying or no monitoring for the first 2 years. But beginning in 1972, a young graduate student began monitoring these animals every year. And then eventually he and some other colleagues kept it up. And the counts were generally declining over that period of time, although there were seasonal concentrations noted at Blanco Reef in the summer, and that's down near the Rogue River, and at Simpson Reef on the north up by Cape Arago, and 15 pups were born. But what we think happened is that the immediate, upon release, there was immediate emigration of these animals. Basically, they left the area and swam north, and that brought the population below, ultimately below the level needed to withstand expected mortalities. We've gotten a little more recent insight, though, into what may have happened to help trigger that emigration and lack of survival, and that is that the Redfish Rocks release was somewhat traumatic for the animals. They were towed from the cove at Port Orford in their cages, towed through open water about 3 or 4 miles down to Redfish Rocks, which was a traumatic and dangerous experience for these little guys after their long flight from Alaska. So they did not fare well there. and may have wanted to get the hell out. Likewise, the next year with the release at Port Orford, or intended for Cape Arago, as they set out from Port Orford, which is down there at the bottom of your screen, and the boat went north, they encountered rough weather, a storm was coming in, and so they basically just emptied the animals into the water somewhere before they got to Cape Arago, and the boat turned around and came back. So the conditions were worse for releasing these animals into a storm event and not in optimum habitat. We would not do either of those events that way today. We do see occasional animals that show up on the Oregon coast. This is a photo taken from a man's deck on Schofield Creek, down the tributary to the Umpqua River in Reedsport. And we could hardly believe our eyes when we saw this photograph, but that's definitely a sea otter. So we see what are almost certainly young males that are drifting down from the Olympic coast population looking for a good time. So the question is, does the loss of sea otters matter? Is this really important? And the answer is yes, there are two ways that it matters. And the first is the cultural loss to the tribes. As I said, for 15,000 years, sea otters and coastal Indian people lived with each other, and the relationship was strong. And at about the same time that sea otters were exterminated from the Oregon coast, coastal Indian people also lost their homelands about the same time, and that long cultural relationship was lost. So we think that that loss of sea otters matters a lot in a cultural sense. It also matters in an ecological sense, because sea otters were essential and still are essential to the diversity and productivity of marine and estuarine ecosystems. So that ecological loss is with us today. You know, I grew up on the Oregon coast and was unaware for many, many years until relatively recently what the absence of sea otters was likely to have meant for our Oregon nearshore ecosystem. To talk more about it, my colleague John Goodell with the Alaka Alliance is going to talk about the science of sea otters and the ecology of kelp ecosystems and why sea otters are important. So John, take it away, buddy.
Okay, thanks, Bob. I am trying to see if I can advance the slide here, but I don't think I can.
All right, there you go. I'll do it for you.
Okay. All right, thanks. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. And I wanted to talk a little bit about this ecological relationship. And as many of you may know, and Bob has mentioned before, that sea otters are really the nexus of a healthy kelp ecosystem. And for a lot of species, you know, we talk about species and we use terms like focal species and umbrella species and keystone species. And there's so many weird terms like that in the ecological community that it almost becomes difficult to figure out what they really mean. But in the terms of a keystone species, the sea otter is almost the quintessential example of a keystone. It has this sort of disproportionate influence on its ecosystem beyond its immediate needs of food and space, and it actually affects the structure of the habitat or ecosystem around it, and also how it functions. Go ahead, Bob.
Well, let's see. I'm not advancing it either. There we go. No, there we go.
So and before we really appreciate our understanding of this relationship between otters and kelp, I wanted to go through a little bit of history of ecology, because when we think of conservation biology, it's hard to often realize how new this discipline is within the scientific field as a whole. The sort of conservation biology really came from the discipline of ecology, but ecology itself is a very new discipline. So the story really starts in the publishing of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, where he does allude to ecological relationships with wildlife. And then a Sand County Almanac was, of course, there was a lot of pre-ecology in there, and of course environmental ethics and an emphasis on conservation. But Silent Spring by Rachel Carson was a great example of the ecological community ecology, because there were these trophic systems that she described, and how a pollutant, in the case of DDT, would move through the trophic systems in an ecological framework. And there was some work like MacArthur Wilson, which they helped launch the field of community ecology. Then we had the Endangered Species Act, and then really the formal launch of the conservation biology discipline was really the late 70s, early 80s. So it's really important to remember that the whole world of understanding the complex relationships between species in an ecological setting is only just a few decades old. And the breakthrough for sea otters was, of course, Jim Estes. So Jim Estes, as a graduate student, was trying to find a project to work on, and he got an opportunity to go out to the Aleutian Islands and to try to really formulate a thesis question as a master's student. And he went out there, and one of the first things that was incredibly evident was on Anchitka Island, where sea otters were present. There was abundant kelp and a lot of the fish species and other related aquatic life that are associated with kelp. And then on Shemya, where sea otters were absent, there was these urchin barrens. And so this was an incredible opportunity. He sort of stumbled upon this almost perfect island experiment where you had a predator in one island laboratory and the predator was absent in the other island laboratory. And so he published his work, and what it showed was that where no otters are present, you have this incredible abundance of sea urchins and an incredible lack of kelp. And where sea otters had been present for some time, kelp was incredibly abundant and sea urchins were essentially almost absent. And as Jim Estes worked with a lot of his colleagues over the ensuing decades, and he started to build out this understanding with more follow-up research. And here's an example of some of those research projects where in an area where sea otters were present, in the upper left-hand corner there of that chart, you can see that there's a high fish abundance where sea otters are present, and then there's a relatively lower fish abundance where sea otters are absent. And then with mussel growth, similarly, where sea otters are present, the mussel growth is much higher. So in other words, there's more kelp detritus, there's more things for them to eat compared to where they're absent. And down in the bottom left, you can see their research on the diets of gulls. Where sea otters were present, gulls tended to eat more of a fish diet, and where gulls were absent, they tended to be, trying to salvage or scavenge more shellfish. And in the case of bald eagles, that was interesting also, similarly, where bald eagles were primarily preying on fish in where the otters are present, where in the islands or the regions where otters are absent, bald eagles were shifting more to preying upon waterfowl or water birds. And this research just kept going. And I think what's really important to appreciate about the research on sea otter ecology and community dynamics is that it's one of the most robust, long-term, and repeated sort of canons of scientific exploration that there is. And many researchers have since followed up and sort of seen these same trends where sea otters are absent. You can see in that left-hand column of that graph, you have some small macroalgae or maybe some small kelp and a lot of sea urchins. And as sea otters become present for longer periods of time, the kelp community becomes more robust and in some ways more like an old growth forest, in quotes, where kelp stalks become thicker and larger and more established over time. And beyond kelp, so when we think of the research on other habitats in the near shore, eelgrass is an important one. And so some recent research on eelgrass and sea otter presence shows that a lot of these small sea slugs and snails, et cetera, that are really key to grazing on that sort of small algae that sort of clogs the eelgrass community, that when otters are present, they keep the crabs and the small predatory crustaceans from consuming all of those small sea slugs and snails. When sea otters are absent, those predatory crabs and other shellfish that are preying upon the sea slugs and snails will remove a lot of them, and the result of that, interestingly, is the drop in productivity and health of the eelgrass beds in general. And so eelgrass, of course, is this really important community for water quality. Healthy eelgrass habitats improve water quality, especially in estuaries, increase biological productivity, and they're known to be an important habitat for juvenile salmon and other fish. And of course, finally, another benefit is about carbon storage. And with sea otters present, with a healthy and growing amount of kelp, what scientists are realizing is that that's sort of a positive sequestration event. So the more sea otters you have, or the healthier the sea otter population is, the long, they're there for some time in a given nearshore environment. Kelp will thus expand or not decrease, and it is much more productive for carbon storage than the counterpart, which would be an urchin barren in many cases. And so why is this so important? And we've alluded to some of this, but kelp, of course, provides this key ecological service in and of itself to the near shore of places like Oregon. There's two species, the bull kelp, which is the common species in Oregon and north in the Pacific Northwest, but there's also the giant kelp, and that's more of a California, its range is within California, but it has been known to have existed in Oregon, and there's apparently a small remnant population on the southern coast of Oregon. But it provides this very important, complex, three-dimensional habitat. It is sort of like a forest in the water. It's a nursery habitat and a nursery of biodiversity and productivity. It's where a lot of rockfish larvae and juvenile rockfish will hang out for some time, including other species. It provides, of course, captures the sun's energy, and as it decays, it releases nutrients into the water. That's the food base for many, many other marine life. It buffers the ocean, buffers the waves and currents on the near shore. So the near shore environment is buffered from a lot of heavy wave action with a healthy kelp forest in place. And we mentioned carbon storage. So we've alluded to some of this, but in general, a healthy kelp forest will build these more complex and resilient food webs. And so in a kelp environment, you're going to have more eggs and larvae retained, often from distant sources. So you may have species of fish that actually are not in kelp as a primary habitat, but the juvenile or eggs or larvae will be in kelp for certain key stages of their life history. And so it's important to realize that, like riparian habitat in a terrestrial community, not all things live in the riparian streamside habitat throughout the year, but riparian habitat is this key ribbon of life that most of the species in that, say, mountain environment will use at some point in their life history. Kelp is the corollary in many ways of that. It is known as the substrate for herring spawning and in other invertebrate grazers, obviously, and it's also known as a habitat for salmon. And when we talk about conservation policy and how kelp and kelp-related species tie into that, as you may know, the Oregon Conservation Strategy is a guiding document that guides the conservation priorities and priority species, both in the terrestrial and marine environment. And there's about 30 species that are strategy species. So these are listed species, not threatened and endangered, but listed as very important for conservation action. And there's about 30 species that are at some point in their life history dependent upon kelp habitat. So it's roughly about half of all the marine species listed in the strategy. So that's a pretty astounding proportion, and it points to the need to really focus on kelp from a sort of a legal and regulatory point of view. And we talked a lot about what's going on in the water, but there are some benefits from kelp to the actual beach, and of course bringing that nutrients onto the beach and providing foraging opportunities for birds, and of course the downstream effects of that, where you have raptors like peregrines that are chasing and hunting and catching some of those shorebirds that are feeding on kelp. So that's another localized effect that can be very important. But so where is kelp? What are the trends of kelp in Oregon? This is a really complex question. There's a graduate student that has been trying to answer that question with aerial photography and look at trends in kelp in Oregon over time. Sarah Hamilton out of Oregon State University, PhD student. And from some of her research, that looking at these images, she sort of concluded that there's a lot of variability. And so it's disappeared in some areas. It's been abundant in some areas. There's a lot of variation year to year, and most of the kelp, of course, are on the south coast. But in recent years, and I mean in the last 2 or 3 or 4 years, there's a notable spread of urchin barrens. And this is front and center here and now, right in Oregon, is Port Orford, an example of a before and after shot. This is happening right here. And some of the reasons for that are, well, before we mention some of the reasons for that, it's important to describe the difference. So when we think of urchin barrens, and I think it leaves folks with a negative impression of urchins in general, but there are 2 different species here in Oregon that have different issues. The purple is the one that is more the culprit in these recent expansion of urchin barrens, and they have a low commercial value. They're typically in shallower water, but now they're being seen in these subtidal zones, rocky subtidal zones at deeper depths in these big barrens. They're more active, so they move more to sources of macroalgae to consume them, and they often outcompete reds, whereas the red urchin is the one that has the commercial value currently. It's larger. It typically is in deeper water. It's primary, or it's known to be primary detritus feeder, so it moves proportionally less. It often will be in an area and collecting detritus, macroalgae detritus that is coming through in a current. It's a boom and bust fishery, but currently there's just a few remaining operators that are currently urchin divers. So when we talk about the changes in Oregon's doorstep, and with respect to the purple sea urchin, as you may have heard, there was a big ocean warm blob, or they called it the blob, which is a big body of water off the Oregon coast and much of the Pacific Northwest that seems to have had some pretty serious consequences to things like the sunflower sea star, which is another important urchin predator. So you have this sort of perfect storm of the sunflower sea star is missing due to the sea star wasting disease, which started in 2013. Some sea star species may have rebounded, but the Pycnopodia, the sunflower sea star, has not. And so it's sort of a perfect storm. Sea otters are not here. We've lost the Pycnopodia, the sunflower sea star, and there's nothing to counteract that lack of balance or that event. So what are some of the strategies? One of the things we realized was pre-reintroduction, or before a prospective reintroduction of sea otters, which could be, say, 4 to 5 years out before the first individuals may hit Oregon coast, there's a need to potentially look at preserving kelp oases, so almost mini preserves, places that we can hold on to against the tide of urchins, so to speak, before sea otters get here. Although sea otters will improve kelp habitat once they're here, they need kelp. They need at least something to anchor to, literally and figuratively. And so one of the strategies that the partners are considering is the idea of trying to implement an urchin market, develop an urchin market with purple sea urchins. So maybe have some targeted areas. Urchin divers will dive and collect purple urchins in some of these areas to protect some healthy standing kelp areas. So sort of targeting, identifying a good spot, collecting urchins that get potentially near there or threatening that spot, and help enable kelp recovery by removing those urchins, bringing them into aquaculture, because as you can imagine, in an urchin barren, urchins do not typically have a lot of roe or uni, because they're in a starvation state. Once they achieve this saturation in a barren, they run out of food, and they they basically start losing their uni. And so removing those sea urchins from their ocean floor, feeding them in an aquaculture condition, and then selling them to market may be a solution, at least a bridge or a short-term solution to maintaining some kelp oases for the near term.
So I'm back again.
Hand it back to Robert.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Are we there?
Yep, they can hear you.
Okay, good. All right. I'm going to turn off my video. All right. So we're looking ahead to a time of post reintroduction. There's enough, to think about the mechanics of introduction, of translocating some animals to Oregon. But what are we looking at beyond the time that sea otters come back? We're looking at a suite of cultural and economic impacts to coastal communities. Certainly, it's the restored connection between sea otters and the coastal tribes that will be very important. We believe that there will be improved habitat for commercial and recreational fish species, as John talked about. In fact, we're already talking to some of the recreational fishermen on the North Coast who are seeing the loss of kelp due to sea urchins, and they are really seeing their fisheries decline. So we're hoping that we'll see that improved habitat and likewise an increased ecosystem resilience as we build in more factors within the ecosystem that can withstand these changes that the ocean is going through. And we think there will be an economic boon to tourism and wildlife viewing, as there has been in the Monterey Bay area for sure. So other impacts are likely to be, though, some conflicts with existing ocean users. In this last 100+ years in which sea otters have been absent and the growth of some shellfish industries on the coast, some of those may be impacted by sea otters returning. So there may be some local competition with commercial harvest of Dungeness crab and red urchin, and some local competition with recreational crabbers and clam diggers. And those are some things we're going to have to sort out. I guess the part of it is that sea otters are not going to be everywhere all at once. They're going to be in some specific locations, at least for a few decades. So when I say local competition, that's what I mean. So we need to be picking our spots carefully to minimize these potential conflicts. We're already in dialogue with the Dungeness crab and red urchin folks about how this may play out, and we think that there are some ways to resolve those potential conflicts. Some of the realities that we're looking at is that this is going to take some time, another 5 or more years before we actually are moving animals from one area to another. Part of that is the need to harness the efforts of many different entities in Oregon and beyond, and by entities I mean the agencies, organizations, outfits like the Seattle Aquarium, the Monterey Bay Aquarium, veterinarian services, and so on, as well as public support. We need to be clear on our scientific understanding of the risks and benefits and opportunities. And of course, we need sustained funding. This doesn't just fall out of the sky. We need to know more about habitat conditions. As these urchins are sweeping through various areas, we need to understand kind of where habitats have changed to either support or not support sea otters coming back. There's a number of issues yet to be addressed about where the source population should be, administrative and legal requirements. As John indicated, the marine environment is changing right before our eyes, so that's a reality we need to be aware of. And it will take time to fully realize the ecological benefits of restoring sea otters. Now, the reality is that just because you put a population into one area doesn't mean that overnight the ecological balance will be restored. It will take time. And likewise, it will take time for that initial population to expand into other areas on the coast for the reasons I said at the outset, which is that these animals really don't move around very much. So expansion is slow and takes several decades. And finally, no matter what you plan for, Mother Nature always bats last. So let's talk briefly about the Alaka Alliance. We'll wrap it up here. We are an Oregon nonprofit that began in the early 2000s by Dave Hatch, a Siletz tribal member. We formally organized it in 2018, and at the present, the Oregon Wildlife Foundation is our fiscal sponsor. But we have applied for 501c3 status from the IRS, and we'll be flying with our own wings soon. So our mission is to restore a healthy population of sea otters to the Oregon coast, and in the process, make Oregon's marine ecosystem more robust and resilient. Here's our board of directors. We've got some really good people on there. Not going to go through all of them now, but suffice to say, it's a great team. Surrounding us, even at that, are many others who are helping us out. So our strategic tasks are to assess the scientific and economic feasibility of bringing back sea otters, to help the region reach consensus on restoration, that it's a good idea. And if we can achieve those two, then we will proceed with restoration in carefully chosen places along the coast. So what we have done already in 2018 and 19 is we started by holding a status of knowledge scientific symposium that was very well attended, and I think set the stage for understanding what the challenges are as we look at this effort. We completed a strategic plan in 2019 with funding from the Memorial Trust. Right now in 2021 through 21, we have contracted for a feasibility study with funding from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to assess those scientific-based issues around the risks, the benefits, the opportunities, the limitations, and so on, the feasibility of bringing sea otters back to Oregon. And I'm really pleased that we have one of the world's top sea otter scientists who's leading up that effort. And we've embedded that with the scientific and technical advisory committee of some really good people from a lot of different interests here in Oregon who will be helping advise that process. In addition, we're out constantly connecting with people and organizations about our mission, again, with funding from the Meyer Memorial Trust. So what we plan to do are some additional things. We need to do an economic impact assessment. We've got some funding requests out for that. We need to understand the impacts on some of these other ocean uses and communities, as the economics of that. We need to assess our existing information about sea otters and habitats and prepare a research plan so that we can selectively and thoughtfully go after additional research to fill those data gaps. We plan to hold a second status of knowledge symposium in October of 2021. We had originally planned it for this coming October, but we all know what happened and nobody's going anywhere by this October. So we're hoping to hold it in another year or so. We're continuing to produce, like tonight, these web-based opportunities to learn about our mission, and of course, we're building strategic relationships. So you can go to our website, www.alakaalliance.org, or just Google that. Sign up to receive our raft email updates. Please hit the donate button and provide what you can. That's what makes the world go around. We've got a lot on this website in terms of sea otter science and things to learn about. So we want this to be the best possible site for learning about sea otters and kelp ecosystems. Follow us on Facebook. We try to post several times a week or more items of interest, not just about sea otters, but related things about the marine environment and kelp and other species. Let's see, why is this not going? There we go. We have a YouTube channel where you can go find and watch all of the presentations from that first symposium. None of them are very long, but they're all really good. And so if you want to learn more, check it out. You can just Google it. And finally, John has produced for us a series of podcasts with some of the leading sea otter and ecosystem people in the world. Very interesting stuff. I don't know why you put mine up there first, but those are good to listen to when you're doing the dishes. So check out our podcast archives. And as this guy says, we'll see you soon. Okay, that's it. Aaron,
Thanks, Bob.
Danielle.
Yeah, we'll jump into my presentation here, and then go into question and answer. So I'm going to be pretty brief, and for those who are returning guests, you've definitely heard from me. I'm Danielle Moser. I'm the Wildlife Program Coordinator for Oregon Wild. I'm going to just quickly touch on what Oregon Wild's doing, what's our role in this space, and yeah, so let's get into it so we get to the questions. Again, if you've tuned into these webcasts, you've heard my overview of our wildlife program, how we approach our work. So I'm not going to dive too deep into it. If you are interested in hearing more about it, you can check out our beaver webcast or our marbled murrelet one or our California condor, where I give, I think, a little bit more of a comprehensive overview. So in addition to checking out those other species webcasts, you can learn more about what I'm working on. But suffice it to say, for Oregon Wild and myself, the kind of lone person here in the wildlife program, there's obviously a myriad of species I could be working on in the state. I choose to focus on those that have, as John pointed out, are kind of ecological keystone species, which I think, you're probably all now well versed in that. I think, I sort of expand the definition of a keystone species to include both political and social. And of course, species can fit into all different of these categories. But basically what I mean by that is, a political keystone species, in addition to, potentially seeking protections for that individual species, can bring in other issues such as forest protection or discussion about wetlands restoration. So there's sort of this anchor to bringing in other issues that are top of mind. Often they can be politically contentious issues, but yeah, the idea is that they really, in looking through that lens, can really expand and bring in a bunch of other issues. And then finally, the social, which I think is really vitally important, because we really can't do any of this work unless people are engaged, and unless folks like you are taking action, are engaged, are advocating for the different things with different wildlife. So so we have obviously, and I give this example a lot, so sorry if you've heard this on other presentations, but to the degree that some folks care about the red treble, it's not exactly a charismatic species that sort of get the masses out to a lobby day visit. And so those are, tend to be sea otters and wolves and beavers, these ones that, again, we kind of use as that to open the gate to wildlife conservation, and then, you bring into the fold and work on other issues related to wildlife. So that's just a quick overview about our program. And then, again, to our role in this, in sea otter restoration and recovery. I've been working with Bob now for several years, and feel honored to get to work with the Alaka Alliance, and they obviously are the experts on the science and really leading the collaborative part of this, the bringing up together of all these different stakeholders. I would say Oregon Wild's role is about, again, to that, from inspiration to action, making sure that we're reaching large numbers of Oregonians who at some point we're going to need you all, to what Bob said, either donating or, writing an elected official or testifying in front of the Fish and Wildlife Commission. So that's kind of our role in this space. You have on you can see on my screen, the education and outreach, similar to what the Alaka Alliance has done. We also produced a podcast, which Bob and many of the board members from the Alaka Alliance were featured in it. We have blogs, webcasts like this, we've done public events, and of course social media. But I think our unique space is in the advocacy. For those who know our Wild Ones program, that's where we help sort of demystify the political process for people. It's where we do trainings on advocacy, and just make people feel comfortable with engaging, especially when it comes to, again, reaching out to your decision makers, calling a member of Congress, testifying in front of the Fish and Wildlife Commission. So that's really, I think, my role and Oregon Wild's role is to be that bridge to you all, make sure that we're harnessing that energy and that excitement about wildlife conservation and turning it into action. So I'm not going to say more, because I think let's leave some time for question and answer. But yeah, thank you for tuning in again tonight.
Okay.
All right, bringing everyone back. We've got some really good questions. from some people who just left.
Oh,
But I think this is a really good one because it's interesting. If urchin barrens get so large that urchins don't have food, don't they die off and potentially allow the kelp to come back?
Ooh, good question. What we know from the biologists who have studied these things is that sea urchins go into, it's a technical term, but it's called a zombie state, where they literally can exist for years and years and years without eating. They just sort of exist and wait for food to come. So no, they don't die. They're just there waiting.
They get to be over 100 years in some cases.
Oof.
Yeah, that's why people in the Port Orford area are where they really do depend on kelp forests for their fisheries. They are more than a little concerned over these urchin barrens because, as I say, they don't die. They just wait for their next meal to come by.
What's the difference between the northern sea otter population and the southern sea otter population?
In terms of genetics, not much. In fact, there's a robust discussion in the sea otter world about whether or not there's even enough distinction at the genetic level to call them subspecies. There are some morphological differences. The southern sea otters tend to be a little lighter in color in their fur and are slightly smaller overall in average size, but there's no breeding difference. There's no life history difference. So genetically, and especially with the bottlenecks, the genetic bottlenecks that occurred because of the fur trade and the winnowing down of these populations to just little remnants, and the fact that they're all mixed up these days, that there probably really isn't much distinction between them.
What will keep, so say there is a reintroduction program, what would keep the otters from just emigrating back like may have happened before?
Nothing. Once you put them in the water, they're going to do what they want, which is why we're really trying to understand where would be an optimum place or places to put them, and to select the source population in such a way that the animals that come back, that there's a good mix of males and females. You may want to start with some males first because they tend to be the more exploratory, and then bring in the females. But as well as making sure that they're all healthy, that their handling and their release are as good as possible, and not just throw them in the water and wish them luck. So,
Yeah.
But fundamentally, Mother Nature bats last. We can't control them once they're in the water. John?
I would add to that of the reintroductions that have occurred, which is British Columbia, Washington, and parts of Alaska, that Oregon is the only failed reintroduction.
Yeah.
So what we think is that there were just a perfect storm of some technical mistakes, and that explains that. So that's what I think that's what we think now.
Well, we are encouraged by the fact that of the animals that stuck around, they did stay and reproduced, had pups. They clearly got to know the area because they seemed to move back and forth between about Cape Arago and the Rogue River. So we're optimistic that if we can take care of some of these handling techniques and be careful in our selection, that we've got a pretty good shot.
Sorry, a lot of questions have been coming in.
Yeah.
One observation about urchins is, of course, urchins depends on the species. So there's a scientist that is pointing out that we're talking about a couple different species of urchins.
Yes.
Can kelp forests be planted?
Probably not in the way that the word implies, but I think what John was talking about with these kelp refugia or oases is to see if we can keep sea urchins out of an area long enough for the kelp to reestablish. And bull kelp propagate annually. So by keeping urchins out, young kelp will regrow in their habitat areas. So in some respects, that's like planting it.
are there any urchin smashing programs or plans in Oregon, like there have been in off the coast of California?
There's
No, and
sorry, Bob.
chime in on this too, John, but no, not in the way that down around Fort Bragg and other areas that they've done. John, go ahead.
Well, up in British Columbia, there's a researcher there, Dr. Lynn Lee, who's doing some work experimentally testing the effects of urchin removals, and they are doing some smashing in addition to removing for consumption. But I think that the main concern amongst managers is to make sure that the folks hearing about this understand, as the person alluded to earlier in the question, that there are different species with different issues. And so what we want to avoid is the public getting the wrong idea about red urchins, for example.
And even ODF&W is not real keen on smashing purple urchins. There's some reasons biologically and sort of from a management point of view that they're not real keen on that as a solution.
Can you speak to which tribes you're working with in the Alliance, or maybe even outside the Alliance, on this effort? There
are two of our board members are members of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, and they've been the tribal council's been very supportive of this effort and helped us fund the first symposium. And then the man who's the tribal chief of the Coquel Indians is also on our board and has been very instrumental in helping to guide our direction. We're in communication with folks from the Confederated Tribes of Coos, Lower Umpqua, Siuslaw Indians, as well as the Grand Ronde tribes. So the Siletz and the Coquels are the most active, but we're trying to keep others involved too.
Some of this was addressed, but aspirationally and looking further out, when could we, best case scenario, see sea otters off the Oregon coast? Are we talking about 10 years, 20 years, 30 years?
Personally, I think we can do this in less than 10 years. If we can find the sustained funding to help, there's a lot of moving parts here to keep those going. But I think we can have animals in the water within 10 years. And that includes the time for all of the federal permits and reviews, which takes a while. So I'm optimistic that it'd be well within 10 years that we can do it. I may be wrong, but I think we will get a pretty good indication of our likelihood of success about a year from now when this feasibility study is completed. And that's going to give us a pretty good idea, and I think probably a reality check of what we're up against, both in a positive and a negative sense. But after that, it's a question of going through the hoops to satisfy what will eventually be the assessments and analyses that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and ODF&W have to do to approve this translocation permit. And ultimately, it's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that approves it, but we want the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife to be in lockstep with that decision too.
And to your point, Bob, just for folks so they know that, you can't just go out and say, oh, we want to take from this source population. It just depends on if that population is an endangered species listed, is it Marine Mammal Act protection. So there's a lot of, like Bob's alluding to, there's just a lot of layers and facets to the different sort of guiding, laws that protect that particular source population, depending on where that would come from for Oregon. So
there's probably a couple of communities in Southeast Alaska that would give us 1,000 or so if we got one up there with a van and brought them home.
One of the questions was, where is the most populated otter place?
Well, all of Southeast Alaska. As I said in that one slide, the estimate is between 25 and 30,000 sea otters in that region. It's a big region, obviously, but so it's likely that animals would come from that population. However, there are also reasons to think about southern sea otters, especially, and here's a little twist, stranded pups in California currently have the opportunity to be reared in a surrogate setting through the Monterey Bay Aquarium, where they match up a a stray or abandoned pup with a surrogate mother and rear in a tank environment, then those animals are increasingly being released in Elkhorn Slough because it's a much more benign marine environment or estuarine environment than the open ocean. There may be an opportunity to bring some of those surrogate reared pups to Oregon to release them here too. And if that is the case, then you are matching up some southern sea otter genetics with northern sea otter genetics, and that has real conservation value too. So the source populations are, that's a question that we really need to engage the entire sea otter community from Alaska to California in helping us figure it out. That's not going to be our decision. It's going to be a bigger decision.
I'm going to make this one the last question, although we've got a couple more, and I'll send around, you can send us additional questions through our websites. I'll send around some contact information in the follow-up email tomorrow, so people can have the website links right there, as well as the follow-up to in that follow-up email, as well as the sign up for next week's webcast, and it will have the video to this. So if there's any of the slides that you wanted to really dig into, everybody who signed up will have that. But as the final question, and I think this is a good way to wrap things up, thinking about ways that we can be involved. We talked about donating, taking action. Who are our targets when we talk about that? Is some of it the congressional delegation? Is it the Fish and Wildlife Service? Is it the state agencies? And how do people that might not be in Oregon, if you're in California, Washington, or someplace else, are there opportunities for those people to make their voices heard in support of these reintroduction efforts?
Ooh, good question. Let's start at the local level. It's going to be critically important that all of our coastal legislators, representatives and state senators are supportive of this. And so, not that they have veto power, but in Oregon's a pretty small state. So if somebody's cranky with this decision, it's going to be a problem. So we want everybody holding hands. So let's start at that local legislative level. Talk to your state legislator, your rep, and your senator, whether you live on the coast or not, and tell them you really support this. The second level is the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Fish and Wildlife Commission. Right now, we have an excellent working relationship with the staff, but there's been no policy decisions made at the sort of the commission level. And so at some point, we're going to be in front of the commission talking to them about this, and it'd be really great to have public support so that they know that this is important to the public as well as ecologically. As I say, there may be some conflicts with some of the crabbers, some of the urchin divers, and some of the recreation folks too. And there will be concerns about this. So the Fish and Wildlife Commission and staff need to know that the public supports this. At the congressional level, Senator Merkley's been very supportive, and you can give him kudos for that, both in terms of financial support and having him lean on U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to support our project. And really, it's not just about the sea otters, it's about restoring and maintaining healthy nearshore ecosystems. So if you live outside the area, I would say too, these issues are common in California, they're common in Washington, and that's the need to maintain and protect our marine environment, and sea otters are one way to do that. So I must say the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at the state level has been very helpful here, but they can always use public support and encouragement. So that's about as much as I can say. John, you got anything further?
Yeah, you could go to our website, and in the Engage tab, you can drop down to our plan, where there's an option. If you are part of an organization or a business, you can endorse our plan, and that will help us sort of show a broad level of support for what we're trying to do. Yep. And also opportunities to donate. There's opportunities to volunteer, and volunteering, of course, can take a variety of different dimensions, which don't have to be in person. So those are just a few other avenues.
I would just encourage too that the continued education. I mean, I'm sure that all of us talk to people who don't realize actually that there are sea otters off our coast, or so just that kind of getting people up to speed so that when the time comes where we, to Bob's point, really need, testimony to the Fish and Wildlife Commission, meeting with these legislators, that folks are pretty informed and ready to go. So.
All right. Well,
Yeah, I want to thank Danielle, you and Oregon Wild, and you, Aaron, for making this possible for us tonight and to expose our work to a much wider audience than we've had previously. So I want to thank you. I also want to say to people watching, we may be putting you on our email list to get our newsletter. And if you don't want that to happen, please unsubscribe as soon as you get it. But we're going to take shameless advantage of this opportunity while we have it.
all right. And with that, thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great night, and I hope to see your name on a long scrolling list over here next week. All right, bye.
Thank you.